When I opened the door to the basement studio and saw myself on the easel, my breath caught in my throat. Not because I was nude or exposed, nothing of that sort. It was the way he painted me. My shoulders slightly hunched, my eyes half closed, my mouth parted in something that looked too much like longing. It was me, but not the me I saw in mirrors every morning. It was the version of myself I thought had died a decade ago. And it was clear he had seen her. I reached out and touched the edge of the canvas, my fingertips grazing the texture of dry paint, the remnants of his brushstrokes. A shiver went down my spine, not because of the chill in the studio, but because I could feel his presence in every inch of that portrait. I didn't hear him come in. I turned, startled, and there he stood, his shirt stained with color, eyes locked on mine. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Everything I had forgotten how to feel, everything I had locked away so tightly, stirred inside me. I should have walked away. I should have said something, anything. But instead, I stood there like a woman I no longer recognized. Before I go any further, let me tell you how it all began. Because this isn't a story about a portrait. It's a story about being seen, after years of invisibility. And maybe, about being loved. Tell me, have you ever let someone see you in a way you swore no one ever would? Leave a comment with your city and let me know, have you ever hidden something so deep, so carefully, only to have it discovered anyway? I used to sleep through my mornings. Not because I was tired, but because waking up early only reminded me of how little awaited me. My husband had always been an early riser, disciplined, meticulous, on a schedule so tight it left no room for spontaneity. I'd hear the click of the front door around 6:45 a.m., like clockwork, followed by silence that stretched over the house like a film of dust. That morning wasn't any different. The other side of the bed was cold, the sheets untouched. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff, and reached for my robe. The mirror across the room caught me off guard. My reflection was, not cruel, just honest. The curve of my waist had softened, my collarbones no longer cut sharp beneath my skin. I wasn't ugly, I never thought of myself that way, but I looked like a woman slowly fading into the wallpaper of her own life. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of toast. He had left the toaster crumbs again. I brushed them into the sink and made myself coffee. As I stirred the cream in, I thought about how often I spoke during the day. Not just to anyone, but out loud. My own voice had become foreign to me. That's the part no one warns you about, the quiet becomes a kind of erasure. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated, then opened it to find him standing there with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a sketchpad tucked under one arm. My stepson. Well, technically. He had been in my life since he was 13, but I had never dared call myself his mother. He smiled in that way artists do, distracted and present at the same time. Dad said I could stay here a few weeks, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. The apartment's being fumigated. I nodded. Of course. My husband had mentioned it in passing, but I hadn't been paying attention. I didn't mind, truly. I had always liked him. There was something open about him, curious. Like the world hadn't worn him down yet. He set up in the basement, the old studio my husband used before he gave up painting. I watched from the top of the stairs as he rearranged canvases, opened windows, and brought in life like a tide. Music started flowing from down there, soft jazz or something instrumental, the kind of sound that lingered and climbed up the walls. That evening, over dinner, we sat in near silence. My husband talked about work, mostly numbers and schedules, meetings and projections. I nodded when required. Across the table, the young man sipped his wine, his gaze drifting toward me now and then. Not in a way that felt inappropriate, more like he was studying something. measuring, sketching me without a pencil. I didn't know what to do with that. After they went to bed, I stayed up. The house was too quiet again. I walked into the living room, then the hallway, then found myself near the basement door. I listened. Nothing. Just the hum of a quiet house. I turned the knob slowly, letting the door open with a gentle creak. The studio was lit by a single lamp. On one of the canvases he'd already started something, a sketch of hands, delicate and tense. They weren't mine, but I imagined they could be. On another, a woman's silhouette, faceless, seated in a chair with her shoulders slightly slumped. There was something about the posture that made my chest tighten. I walked around the room, touching nothing but feeling everything. It smelled like turpentine and something earthy, something alive. A part of me wanted to run my fingers through the tubes of paint, press my palms into the canvases and leave a mark. Any mark. I hadn't realized how long I'd stood there until I heard his footsteps on the stairs. I turned, caught like a thief. He didn't look surprised to see me. Couldn't sleep either, he asked softly. I shook my head. Just wandering. He smiled. I was thinking. I need someone to sit for a piece I'm working on. Would you consider it? It was such a simple question. But it felt like a match, striking something dry and waiting inside me. I nodded. Maybe. He didn't push. Just said goodnight and disappeared again. I climbed back upstairs, my thoughts a knot of confusion and something else I didn't yet have a name for. In bed, I lay next to my husband's sleeping form. I watched the rise and fall of his back, the way his hand curled into a loose fist beneath the pillow. I tried to remember the last time he touched me without habit. The last time he really looked. The image of the studio flashed in my mind. The way the light hit the half-finished canvas. The way I felt, standing in the middle of it all. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, just one sitting. It doesn't mean anything. But even then, I knew. It meant everything. He asked again the next morning. I was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing out a teacup I hadn't even drunk from. My thoughts were elsewhere. The light from the window cast long shadows across the counter, and I remember thinking how my hands looked older in that light. Thinner. More fragile. When he stepped into the room, I didn't turn around immediately. I meant what I said last night, he said. About the portrait. His voice was soft but clear, like someone offering a lifeline and not entirely sure it would be accepted. I turned to face him slowly, unsure of my answer, but already knowing it. What would you want me to do? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Just sit, he said, the way you are now. He smiled, and something in that smile made me feel uneasy and safe at the same time. I told myself it was harmless. That I had been photographed and painted before, in my younger years, when friends dabbled in art and I was bold enough to volunteer. This wasn't new. And yet, it felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with exposure. We arranged for the afternoon. He didn't give many instructions. Just told me to wear something comfortable, nothing that distracted from me. I went upstairs and opened my closet, feeling ridiculous for caring. But I did care. I tried on 3 different tops before settling on a soft gray one that clung just slightly at the waist. It was modest, simple, and still, somehow, flattering. The studio was warm. He had set up a chair near the window, where the light was filtered through sheer curtains. The room smelled of paint and linen and something sharp I couldn't name. I sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. He didn't say much at first. He studied me. His eyes moved across my face, my shoulders, my posture. You always sit like that, he said after a moment. Like you're trying not to take up space. I shifted slightly, embarrassed. Habit, I suppose. Don't, he said. I want you exactly as you are. But not smaller. The first strokes were light. He moved quickly, glancing up and down, the sound of the brush on canvas rhythmic and calming. I tried not to think about how I looked. I focused instead on the feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way, but in a way I hadn't felt in years. My husband looked at me every day, but I couldn't remember the last time he had really seen me. I became aware of my breathing. Of the way my spine curved slightly to one side. Of the scar on my forearm from when I burned myself cooking last winter. All of me, the parts one usually ignored, felt visible in that moment. I wasn't sure if I liked it, but I didn't want it to stop. He didn't talk much, except to ask me to hold still or tilt my chin slightly. I did as he asked, eager to be good at this strange new role. Amuse. The word echoed in my mind like a note in a cathedral. I wasn't sure I had ever felt like one before. Not even when I was younger, more confident. Not even when I was trying to be. We paused for a break. I stood and stretched my arms, and he handed me a glass of water without a word. I thanked him. He nodded. Our fingers touched for a fraction of a second, an innocent accident. But my body reacted before my mind could catch up. A spark, a flutter in my chest. He noticed. I saw it in his eyes. He didn't pull away quickly. Neither did I. I sat again, my heart beating faster now. I didn't want to read into it. I didn't want to assign meaning where there might be none. But the tension in the room had shifted. The air was heavier. Charged. He returned to the canvas and resumed painting, but he was quieter now. More focused. Or more distant. I wasn't sure which. After a while, he stopped and stepped back. That's enough for today, he said, his voice quieter than before. I stood, brushing imaginary dust from my lap. Was I useful? He looked at me for a long moment. You're more than useful. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. Or maybe I wanted it too much. I left the studio and walked upstairs slowly. My legs felt unsteady. My mind was full. Not of anything concrete. Just 1,000 impressions I couldn't sort. Later, during dinner, my husband told a story about a client who had missed a deadline and blamed it on a power outage. He laughed dryly. I smiled at the right moments, nodded where expected. But I wasn't really there. I was back in that chair, sunlight on my cheek, his eyes on mine. After we ate, I cleared the table, careful not to make noise. He turned on the news and didn't glance up. I stood behind him for a moment, watching the back of his head. I remembered when he used to reach for my hand under the table, when he used to brush my hair behind my ear just to feel it. I went upstairs and sat at my vanity. I looked at myself in the mirror again, but this time I saw something else. Not youth, not beauty. But presence. As if I had returned to my own body after a long absence. My fingers went to the gray shirt I'd worn earlier. I didn't take it off. I just traced the collar with the tip of my finger, remembering how it felt to sit still and be noticed. There was a soft knock on the door, but I didn't answer. I knew who it was. I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, and then the door to the basement open again. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then I turned out the light and crawled into bed beside my husband. He didn't stir. I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet, thinking about how silence can feel so different depending on whose company it follows. Tonight, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of something I couldn't yet name. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though nothing about it felt ordinary. He didn't ask me to pose again immediately. Instead, he sketched quietly in the basement, occasionally surfacing to grab coffee or sit in the sunroom with a book. We spoke little, and when we did, our conversations hovered in safe territory: art, the weather, stories from his time in school. But beneath every word, I felt something humming, like the low buzz of a distant storm. Not yet close, but unmistakably on its way. I kept to my routine. Morning tea, laundry, dinner preparation. I smiled at my husband when he came home, answered his questions politely, nodded in the right places. I was attentive, present, but only in form. Something inside me had shifted, and no matter how I tried to silence it, it lingered like a song I couldn't unhear. One afternoon, I came downstairs to collect the empty laundry basket and paused near the studio door. It was slightly ajar. Curiosity nudged me closer. I hesitated, hand on the frame, then stepped inside quietly. He wasn't there. The room smelled richer than before, paint and wood and something almost floral, perhaps turpentine mixed with linseed oil. On the easel stood a canvas turned slightly toward the wall, as if hiding. I shouldn't have looked. I told myself that even as I moved forward. But of course, I did. He had painted me. Not exactly, no face, no identifying features. But the posture, the fall of the shirt over the shoulder, the curve of the back, it was unmistakably me. He had captured something I hadn't seen in years. There was no vanity in the image, no flattery. Just truth. Honest, raw, and unexpectedly tender. My hand trembled slightly as I reached toward the edge of the frame. I didn't touch it, only hovered close enough to feel the weight of the moment. That's when I heard him behind me. "I was going to show you," he said quietly. I turned sharply, startled, caught like a child sneaking into a forbidden room. My mouth opened, but I had nothing to say. His expression was unreadable, not embarrassed, not smug. Just calm. Still. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said finally. He shook his head slowly. "You're not intruding. You're the reason this space feels alive again." I wanted to respond, to dismiss it or laugh it off, but I couldn't. Because a part of me wanted to believe him. A part of me already did. I left the studio in silence, my thoughts louder than ever. That night, I lay awake while my husband slept beside me. I stared at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time I had felt important in someone's life. Not necessary. Not dependable. Important. As if my presence brought color into someone's world, instead of simply keeping it orderly. The next morning, he didn't bring up the painting. Nor did I. But something changed again, subtly. He began leaving the door to the studio open. I would walk past it and see him at work, sometimes standing back to examine a piece, other times hunched over a detail with intense focus. He didn't look up, but I knew he knew I was watching. My husband remained oblivious. He came and went on schedule, his evenings filled with spreadsheets and muted television. He asked once if I'd like to join him at a work event. I declined, citing a headache. He nodded, unsurprised. We didn't fight. We rarely did. It was part of the problem. No fire left to ignite. A few days later, I found a small envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in pencil. Inside was a folded sketch, just a pencil study, rough and unfinished. My face in profile, not idealized but careful. Observant. Real. Alongside it, a single sentence, "I see you." I folded it back and slipped it into the drawer beneath the coffee filters, as though it might burn if I looked at it too long. And yet, I looked at it every morning after that. I began to linger near the studio door more often. Once, I brought him a mug of tea. He accepted it with a nod, didn't speak, but when I turned to leave, he said quietly, "You always walk so gently, like you're afraid to disturb the floor." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His words sat with me the rest of the day. There was a moment, a few days later, when the tension finally cracked. I had come downstairs in the early evening to ask if he wanted anything from the store. A simple, harmless question. He was standing by the window, arms folded, eyes fixed on something outside that I couldn't see. He turned slowly when he heard me. His expression was unreadable again. But this time, it wasn't still. It was tight. Like he was holding something in. "I'm not sure how to act around you anymore," he said. I froze. Not because I was shocked by the words, but because I had been thinking the same thing for days. Weeks, maybe. I swallowed. "Then don't act," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He took a step forward, then another. I didn't move. There was silence. Tense, charged, expectant. And then, we kissed. It happened in an instant. No prelude, no hesitation. And yet it felt inevitable, like something that had been circling us for so long that we had forgotten it hadn't happened already. The moment was brief. The world didn't tilt. There were no violins, no drama. Just a soft collision, a sharp intake of breath, and the quiet sound of parting. I stepped back first. "I should go," I whispered. He didn't stop me. Upstairs, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, palms braced on the sink, my breath uneven. I looked at my reflection and saw everything I had tried to ignore, the flush in my cheeks, the quiver in my lips, the storm in my eyes. I didn't feel young. I didn't feel foolish. I felt alive. And that terrified me more than anything else. The morning after, I moved through the house as if it belonged to someone else. My body completed tasks, brewing coffee, wiping down counters, folding laundry, but my mind lingered somewhere between confusion and clarity. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in the basement. It hadn't been impulsive or careless. If anything, it had felt like the quietest truth I'd spoken in years, just not with words. I told myself it didn't have to mean anything more than it was. A moment. A lapse. Something that could be folded away and hidden, like a letter never sent. But even that felt dishonest. Because the feeling hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown heavier. He didn't avoid me. In fact, he was calmer than before. Respectful, measured, but softer somehow. When we passed each other in the hallway, there was no awkwardness, just something settled between us, unspoken but shared. I began to notice small changes. The way he'd glance up from his sketchpad if I walked into the room. The way he would pause before saying my name, like he was choosing whether or not to say it at all. And I was changing, too. I found myself standing differently in front of mirrors, not in search of flaws, but out of curiosity. Who was I becoming? One afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. I opened it to find a delivery man with a large, flat package. I signed without question and brought it inside. When I opened it, I found a canvas, one of his. Not finished, but close. A woman with closed eyes, half in shadow. The posture was unmistakably mine. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the frame. There was no note. Later that day, I asked him about it. I waited until after dinner, when the house was quiet again, my husband reading in his office. "Why did you send it upstairs?" I asked, standing in the doorway of the basement studio. He looked up, unsurprised. "I didn't want it to stay down here." "Why?" He took a moment before answering. "Because it doesn't belong in the dark." I didn't know what to do with that. It was too poetic, too raw. I turned to leave, but he added, "Would you come with me tomorrow?" I looked over my shoulder. "Where?" "Somewhere I can paint outside." "I've been meaning to, but I don't like going alone." I hesitated. My mind spun through reasons to say no. But my heart, already tired of pretending, beat out a different answer. "I'll think about it." He smiled, but didn't push. That night, I lay awake again, but not from guilt. From anticipation. The next morning was warm, bright, and still. I told my husband I was going to spend the afternoon walking in the park. He barely looked up from his laptop. I packed water, a sweater, and an excuse I didn't believe I'd need. He drove. We left the city behind quickly, trading asphalt for gravel roads and stretches of trees. Neither of us spoke much. The silence wasn't strained, it was mutual, respectful, aware. It wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people who had run out of ways to pretend. He parked near a small lake, secluded and framed by tall grasses. The kind of place that felt untouched, quiet in a way that made sound feel intrusive. He carried his bag and easel, and I carried nothing. He didn't ask me to pose. Not yet. We sat together on the grass for a while. The lake glimmered under the sun. Birds chirped in uneven patterns, like a conversation we weren't meant to understand. He opened a small sketchpad and began to draw, nothing formal, just lines, shapes, movements of the reeds or curves of the horizon. Eventually, he looked at me. Not directly. Sideways, thoughtfully. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just sit." I did. I let the wind move my hair. I let the light catch the side of my face. I closed my eyes at one point and simply breathed. I hadn't realized how loud my life had been until that moment. The absence of machines, of clocks, of footsteps, it was freeing. I wasn't being looked at. I was simply being. He worked steadily. Occasionally he would pause, glance at me, then return to the page. I didn't ask to see what he was creating. I didn't want to. The mystery was safer than the answer. After a while, he stood and stretched. The sun had begun to dip slightly, casting longer shadows across the water. "Would you like to walk?" he asked. We walked slowly along the water's edge, our steps matching unconsciously. He told me stories about a professor who used to sketch with both hands at once. I told him about the first time I tried oil painting, how I cried when the colors bled into each other. We laughed softly, carefully. At one point, he stepped onto a small wooden dock that jutted into the lake. I followed. The wood creaked under our weight, and we stopped at the edge, looking out over the water. "It's beautiful," I said. He nodded. "You are." I turned to him. Not sharply. Not with surprise. But slowly. As if I had expected it. As if I'd been waiting for that sentence to exist between us. We didn't move closer. We didn't speak. The moment didn't demand more than acknowledgement. On the drive back, we spoke even less. The silence was no longer heavy. It was saturated, with everything we hadn't said, and everything we didn't need to. When he dropped me off, I thanked him. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "There's more in you than you think." I didn't ask what he meant. I went inside, set down my bag, and returned to my regular places, the kitchen, the hallway, the quiet. My husband was in the living room, dozing off with the television playing softly in the background. I watched him for a moment. His hand rested on the remote, his breathing slow. I tried to feel something, guilty, shame, even fear. But what I felt was sadness. Not because of what I'd done. But because of what we no longer were. Upstairs, I passed the canvas he had sent me. It leaned against the wall, still half in shadow. I turned on the lamp beside it, letting the light reach it fully for the first time. And then I sat beside it, in silence, watching the paint dry. For the first time in years, I felt like I was becoming. Not escaping. Not betraying. Just becoming. I woke up before the sun the next morning, not out of obligation, but restlessness. The sky was a pale gray, the kind of color that hinted at warmth later but offered nothing in the moment. I sat at the edge of the bed for several minutes before rising, careful not to disturb the sleeping form beside me. My husband mumbled something unintelligible in his sleep, then rolled away from the light seeping through the curtains. In the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror, as I had begun to do more often. Not with self-criticism, but with curiosity. My eyes looked clearer, less dull than they had weeks ago. My skin still held the map of time, of course, lines where laughter once lived, hollows shaped by long-forgotten tears, but I looked awake. Present. That alone felt like something worth noticing. Downstairs, the house was still. I moved through it like a visitor, touching objects as if reacquainting myself. I opened the fridge, but food didn't interest me. I poured coffee and held it close, letting the warmth seep into my palms. By mid-morning, the studio door was open again. I stood at the threshold, unsure if I had been invited or simply expected. He was inside, crouched low over a canvas. When he saw me, he didn't speak. Just nodded slightly and gestured to the chair by the window. I stepped inside. The air smelled familiar now, of paint, worn wood, and something more personal. Something like memory. I sat, not asking what he intended. We had reached a place beyond instructions. He watched me for a moment, then turned back to the canvas. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I lost track. There was something comforting about the silence between us. The way his brush moved with purpose, the way I no longer felt self-conscious under his gaze. At one point, he stepped away and picked up a small mirror. He handed it to me without a word. I looked into it and saw myself from a strange angle, my profile sharp against the light, my mouth slightly parted. "Hold that," he said softly. I did. He returned to painting. I sat frozen, but not stiff. More like a sculpture waiting to be understood. When he finished the first layer, he stepped back and studied it. Then he looked at me, not the version he had just painted, but the living woman in the chair. "You're still holding your breath," he said. I hadn't realized. Later, he invited me to see the piece. I hesitated. But curiosity won. I stood beside him as he turned the canvas around. The image wasn't romanticized. It wasn't softened. It was simply me, looking forward, not directly at the viewer, with a complicated expression. Determination? Fear? It was hard to say. "It's not done," he said. I didn't respond. My throat felt too tight. Because what he had captured wasn't beauty or elegance. It was tension. Hope. A woman on the edge of a choice she couldn't yet name. I didn't know how to thank him, so I didn't. I just placed a hand briefly on his arm before leaving the studio. That night, my husband mentioned he had an out-of-town meeting the next day. He would be gone overnight. I nodded, absorbing the information with practiced neutrality. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he sat in the living room, scrolling through news on his tablet. The water ran hot, scalding my fingers, but I didn't flinch. The pain felt like punctuation, a way to stay rooted in my body. When I went upstairs, I didn't change into my usual sleepwear. Instead, I stood by the window in my robe, watching the light slowly leave the street outside. I thought about the portrait. About the mirror. About the version of myself that had been pulled from beneath the years and placed gently onto canvas. The house was quiet. I stepped out of my room and walked slowly down the stairs. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but I didn't care. The studio door was half open. I pushed it wider and found him seated on the floor, surrounded by charcoal sketches and open tubes of paint. He looked up. We didn't speak. I walked to him. We stood close, too close for anything but honesty. And in that moment, the distance between our thoughts disappeared. We kissed. It was not sudden, not explosive. It was the kind of kiss that holds silence inside it. The kind that says more than any declaration ever could. It was measured, intentional, and impossible to misinterpret. We pulled away slowly. Nothing more passed between us, not words, not gestures. We didn't need them. I turned and left, returning upstairs with steady steps. In my bedroom, my husband still slept. His breathing was deep, even, oblivious. I changed into a loose shirt and climbed into bed. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, tracing the outline of the moment just past. I didn't feel reckless. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen. And that, perhaps more than anything else, terrified me. The morning after felt different. Not because something had shifted in the air or because the world outside my window looked unusual, it hadn't. The streets still hummed with passing cars. The sparrows still fought for a place on the garden fence. But inside me, something had subtly rearranged itself. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, or what to do with it, but I couldn't deny its presence. My husband had left early, as expected. A note sat on the kitchen counter, scribbled in his quick, slanted handwriting. Back tomorrow afternoon. Meeting might run late. Love you. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it between the pages of the cookbook I hadn't opened in years. The house felt strangely hollow in his absence, not because I missed him, but because the usual hum of quiet tension was gone. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt like I had the space to breathe. I spent the morning cleaning, not out of necessity, but because my body needed movement. I wiped surfaces that were already spotless. I rearranged books on the shelf. I even ironed pillowcases, something I hadn't done since our first year of marriage. The repetition of motion helped. It dulled the noise in my head. But nothing could silence it completely. By early afternoon, I was restless again. I found myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, hesitating. I told myself I was just going to see if the light had been left on. But I already knew it hadn't. I descended slowly. He was there, as I knew he would be. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketchpad open in his lap. He looked up when he heard me, but didn't speak. He didn't need to. I crossed the room and sat in the armchair near the far window. The same one where I had posed the first time. It was instinctive, not planned. My body knew the way. I didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer instructions. There was something quiet and mutual about our understanding now. He resumed sketching, his pencil moving lightly across the page. The sound was comforting, a soft whisper against paper that matched the tempo of my breath. I watched his hand more than his face. The way it moved with confidence, with rhythm. The way he seemed to lose himself in what he saw. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time didn't feel linear in that room anymore. Eventually, he paused. "You're different today," he said, not looking up. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure how to put it into words. I began, then stopped. I didn't know the end of the sentence. Not yet. He nodded anyway, as if he understood. Maybe he did. I stood, walked over to where he sat, and looked down at the page. He turned it toward me. It wasn't a portrait this time. It was a study of movement. My hands, in different gestures. One open, one clenched, one mid-reach. Somehow, they looked like they were telling a story I hadn't yet heard. "They're always so expressive," he said quietly. I hadn't realized that. I looked at my own hands, the lines in my palms, the pale crescent of a scar near my thumb. They were older than I remembered. But they were still mine. "Do you want to see the full painting?" he asked. I turned to him. He had never asked that before. I nodded. He stood and crossed the room to where a large canvas was draped with a sheet. With a slow, deliberate movement, he uncovered it. I gasped softly. There I was. Not just a version of me, but the most honest one I'd ever seen. I stood in the center of the canvas, not posed or poised, but caught mid-motion. My face wasn't serene. It was full of emotion. Vulnerability. Defiance. A kind of quiet, aching strength. My eyes weren't focused on anything in the painting, but they held something alive. It was both beautiful and painful to look at. "I didn't know I looked like that," I whispered. "That's how I see you," he replied. I stayed silent, absorbing it. Not just the image, but the meaning behind it. The way he had paid attention. The way he had witnessed me, without judgment, without expectation. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say. "I don't think I can go back to how things were." He looked at me. "You don't have to." "But I don't know what forward looks like either," I added quickly, unsure of what I was even asking from him. His voice was steady. "It's not about knowing. It's about choosing." I wanted to cry, not from sadness, but from the weight of the truth in his words. Because I had spent years drifting, content, safe, numb. And now, for the first time, I was being asked to choose what to feel, how to live. I sat down again, this time closer to him. Not touching, but near enough to feel the warmth between us. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. He returned to his sketches. I watched the light shift across the floorboards. The studio was no longer just a place of paint and canvas. It had become a witness to something unspoken, something unfolding. When I eventually stood to leave, he didn't follow. He didn't ask when he'd see me next. And I didn't offer anything in return. But as I reached the door, I looked back once. He was still sketching, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Upstairs, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table alone. The cup warmed my hands, but it did nothing for the ache inside my chest. I thought of my husband. Of how we used to talk, how we used to laugh at things no one else found funny. I thought of the way his hand used to rest at the small of my back when we walked through crowds. That man still existed. But so did the silence between us. The distance that had become habit. And I thought of the man downstairs. Of the way he had looked at me, not with desire, but with reverence. As if I were something rare. Something worth understanding. I wasn't sure what would come next. I wasn't ready to name anything. Not yet. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had been painted into existence. And I could no longer pretend to be invisible. The evening was quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy one. The kind that fills a room with unsaid things, clings to the corners, and makes even the ticking of a clock feel intrusive. My husband hadn't returned yet. His text had come in a few hours earlier, meeting ran late. "I'll be home tomorrow morning." I stared at those words longer than I needed to, letting them blur together. Then I set the phone down face down and didn't touch it again. I had already tidied the house twice. The kitchen was spotless, the living room arranged just so, every pillow aligned, every magazine stacked. I even found myself dusting shelves I normally ignored. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about avoiding thought. But eventually, the motions grew too familiar, too empty. I sat in the dining room with a glass of water I barely sipped, watching the last streaks of daylight pull away from the walls. I didn't plan to go downstairs. I didn't decide anything at all, really. I simply found myself at the top of the basement steps again, hand resting on the smooth curve of the railing, listening for any sound. There was none. The studio door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of warm lamplight painted the hallway floor. My feet moved without instruction. Inside, the room was unchanged. The scent of paint hung faintly in the air. Canvases leaned against the walls, some finished, some abandoned. His easel stood tall, empty now, like a stage between acts. And he was there, of course. Standing near the far table, flipping through a sketchbook. He looked up as I entered, but didn't smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said softly. I said nothing at first. I closed the door gently behind me and leaned against it. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything we hadn't said thick between us. Then I stepped forward. "Neither was I admitted." He placed the sketchbook down, carefully, deliberately, as if the noise might shatter something fragile between us. We faced each other in that narrow strip of space between canvas and table, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I think we both knew that whatever happened next couldn't be undone. I reached for his hand. Slowly. With trembling fingers. He met mine halfway. We didn't speak again. We spent the night together. It was quiet. Honest. Unrushed. There was no music, no dimmed lights or rehearsed gestures. Just the creak of the floorboards beneath us, the rustle of fabric, the soft cadence of shared breath. We didn't try to make it more than it was, but we didn't downplay it either. It wasn't born from recklessness. It was born from longing, the kind that simmers just beneath the surface for too long until it finally finds air. We lay together afterward, not touching, just close. The lamp still glowed in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls. He stared at the ceiling, one arm resting across his chest. I watched him in the stillness, studying the way his brow furrowed slightly when he was deep in thought, the way his chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. Neither of us spoke for a long time. And when we did, it wasn't about what had just happened. "I have to leave soon," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not surprised. "How long have you known?" "Since before the painting was finished," he said. "I've been putting it off." I turned my head to look at the ceiling too. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less charged. More final. "What happens now?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "That's up to you," he said at last. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. The answer was fair, but it gave me no peace. Because I didn't know. I didn't know how to go back upstairs and sleep beside someone who hadn't noticed my absence. I didn't know how to walk into the kitchen tomorrow and pretend to read the newspaper while my heart beat for a different memory. Eventually, we dressed without speaking. The movements were slow, methodical, like packing after a long trip. He reached for his shirt just as I was smoothing down the hem of my dress. We avoided each other's eyes until we were both fully dressed again, returned to the people we had been before, at least on the surface. I lingered at the door. He followed behind me but didn't try to stop me. There was no last word, no final declaration. Just the soft click of the door as I stepped out and left him in the quiet room we had turned into something sacred. Upstairs, the house felt colder. Not because of temperature, but because the silence here was different. This silence wasn't full of potential, it was full of consequence. I sat on the edge of my bed, not yet ready to lie down. The sheets were untouched. I hadn't slept here the night before, and yet nothing had changed. That was what unsettled me the most. Nothing had changed, but everything had. I stared at the floor, hands folded in my lap, feeling both heavier and lighter than I had in years. The ache wasn't just guilt. It was the ache of realization that once you've been seen, truly seen, you can never go back to invisibility. I stood eventually, turned off the lamp, and lay on the bed in the dark. My body remembered his touch, but my mind was blank. Not out of numbness, but preservation. It was too much to hold all at once. I slept lightly, waking often to the creaks of the house settling, the occasional car passing outside. And when I finally drifted into real sleep, it wasn't peaceful. It was full of blurred images, unfinished sentences, the soft thud of paintbrushes against canvas. Morning would come soon. And with it, everything I wasn't yet ready to face. I woke to the sound of the front door opening and closing, subtle but unmistakable. For a moment, I didn't move. The light in the room was soft, diluted by the overcast sky outside, casting a gray wash over everything. My eyes were heavy, my limbs heavier. Sleep had come in waves through the night, never deep, always restless. Footsteps followed, measured, familiar. My husband had returned. I sat up slowly, smoothing the sheets that had shifted during the night, and reached for my robe. The silence stretched as he moved through the house without calling out. I heard the clink of his keys as they landed in the bowl by the front door, the refrigerator door opening, then closing, the tap of his shoes on the hardwood. He didn't come upstairs. I stayed in the bedroom longer than necessary, giving him time, giving myself space. When I finally descended, the kitchen looked just as I'd left it the night before. He stood at the counter, pouring coffee, back turned toward me. He didn't look up when I entered, but he acknowledged my presence with a single word. Morning. I echoed it, quietly. He slid a second mug toward me on the counter, then stepped back and leaned against the sink, cradling his own. There was a stiffness to his posture I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger, something cooler. More distant. I wrapped my hands around the mug, though I didn't drink. He didn't ask where I had been. He didn't ask why I hadn't replied to his message the night before, or why I hadn't answered when he came in. He didn't ask anything. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small USB stick, and set it on the counter between us. I stared at it for several seconds before looking up. His face was unreadable. I found it in the drawer, he said, voice even. Thought it was work-related. Plugged it in. It wasn't. The room held stillness in a new form, sharper, colder. I didn't reach for the USB. I didn't ask what he saw. The question didn't matter. Whatever he had witnessed on that small device had been enough. Not for an outburst, not for confrontation. But for silence. And that, in some ways, was worse. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He simply stood there, offering me a quiet place to either confess or deny, and I had no idea which one would hurt more. I swallowed hard. The coffee had gone cold in my hands. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I said finally. His jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. I didn't plan it. I didn't look for it, I continued, my voice steady despite the tremble building inside. It just found me. Or maybe I found myself, after being gone so long I forgot what I looked like. He exhaled through his nose and set his mug down. I don't want to hear the poetry of it, he said quietly. That hurt more than if he had shouted. I'm not trying to justify anything, I replied. I'm just trying to tell you the truth. He nodded once, slowly. Then he picked up the USB again and closed his hand around it. For a moment, I thought he might throw it or snap it or say something sharp. But he didn't. He just placed it back in his pocket. I have a meeting, he said. I'll be back later. And with that, he left. The door closed behind him with a soft finality. I stood there, mug still in my hands, the weight of the morning pressing hard against my chest. The house felt different now. Not empty. Not tense. Just altered. Like someone had rearranged all the furniture without moving a single piece. I moved slowly through the rest of the day. I washed the dishes again, though there were only 2. I walked through each room, touching the edges of furniture, staring at framed photos that now looked like relics of someone else's life. The sound of my own breathing became intrusive, like I didn't belong in my own home anymore. Downstairs, the studio was quiet. I didn't go in. His things were still there. His paints, his brushes, the canvases lined up like forgotten thoughts. The air held traces of him, oil and turpentine, the faint echo of jazz he sometimes played. But the space no longer called to me. It felt suspended, like a scene between 2 acts. I sat on the couch in the living room, pulling a blanket over my legs though I wasn't cold. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't move for a long time. In the afternoon, I heard movement from downstairs. I hadn't realized he was still in the house. But the sound was unmistakable, the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of canvas being shifted. I waited, unsure if I should go to him. Unsure if I had the right. Eventually, the sound stopped. I went to the window and watched as he walked up the driveway with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a long, flat package tucked under one arm. He didn't look back. That evening, after the sun had dropped below the trees, I finally descended the stairs. The studio was empty. Completely. Every sketch, every canvas, every brush, gone. Even the smell was fainter now. On the work table, a single sheet of paper remained, folded neatly. I opened it slowly. There was no message. Only a charcoal sketch, unfinished, raw. My hands again. This time clenched tightly together, the tension in every finger rendered with aching precision. I traced the image with my eyes, memorizing the space between my palms. Then I folded it again, carefully, and carried it upstairs. I didn't know what the next day would bring. Or the one after that. But I knew, with unmistakable clarity, that nothing would return to what it had been. Not my marriage. Not my reflection. Not the way I saw the silence between us. He had seen me. And in doing so, he had shown me the cost of being unseen for too long. Now, all that remained was the reckoning. The house had settled into a new kind of silence, one I couldn't quite define. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of illusion. Everything felt stripped of its familiar rhythm. I moved through the rooms like I was visiting a place I had once called home, but now only recognized in fragments. Days passed, though I couldn't say how many. Time had lost its usual weight. My husband returned to his routines, but they were quieter now. He spoke less, lingered less, and stopped asking questions altogether. Not in the cruel way of anger, but in the quiet withdrawal of someone who no longer expects answers. He didn't bring up the USB again. He didn't mention the studio, or the absence of canvases, or the sketch I had carried upstairs and tucked away in my dresser. Instead, he moved through each day with practiced indifference, coffee, meetings, sleep. And I did the same. Except I wasn't indifferent. I was watching everything more closely than ever. His hands, the way they no longer rested on the back of my chair. His eyes, the way they avoided mine during dinner. The way he closed doors more softly now, as if afraid they might echo. One evening, I found him in the garage, standing beside the shelves where we stored old books and broken garden tools. He was staring at a box marked vacation photos. I didn't say anything. I just watched him from the doorway, the way he reached for the lid, opened it halfway, then closed it again. He didn't turn to look at me. He just said, "We used to laugh more." And then he walked past me and out of the garage. That night, I lay awake for hours. The moonlight filtered through the blinds in thin stripes across the bed, and I counted them, over and over, like they might give me a direction. I turned onto my side and faced his back. He was already asleep, or pretending to be. I studied the shape of his shoulders, the slight curve of his spine, and remembered how they used to feel beneath my hands. I wanted to say something. Anything. But I didn't know where to begin. Or if there was any point in beginning at all. The next morning, a package arrived for me. I hadn't ordered anything, and my name, written in black ink on the label, made my breath catch. I brought it inside slowly, setting it on the dining table as if it might contain something breakable. The box was long and flat, wrapped with care. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a painting. His painting. Not one I had seen before. This one was different. It wasn't a portrait. Not entirely. It was more abstract, more layered. My figure was there, unmistakable in shape, but surrounded by light and shadow, texture and movement. The colors were muted, soft grays, earthy browns, pale golds, like autumn before the cold. And in the center of it all, my face turned slightly to the side, eyes closed, a quiet smile on my lips. Not joy. Not sadness. Just peace. Tears rose without warning. They weren't dramatic or heavy. They came slowly, steadily, and I let them. Because something in that painting told me he had seen a version of me I was still trying to believe in. A version I had almost lost. There was a note tucked inside the frame, barely visible. I unfolded it. "You were never invisible. You just forgot how to look back." That was all it said. No signature. No return address. I sat there for a long time, staring at the painting, holding the note in my hands. I didn't know what to do with it. Hang it? Hide it? Burn it? But I did none of those things. I leaned it carefully against the far wall in the living room, where the late afternoon light would fall on it just so. That evening, my husband came home early. He set his briefcase down in the hallway and walked into the room. His eyes found the painting instantly. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't ask what it meant. He simply stared. After a while, he turned to me. "Is that how you see yourself now?" he asked. I paused before answering. "I don't know yet. Maybe." He nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't press further. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and returned to the sofa. We didn't talk about it again. But the painting stayed. It became part of the room, part of the house. I would catch him glancing at it sometimes. I would catch myself doing the same. It didn't hold regret. It didn't hold blame. It just held a moment in time. A version of me that existed between choices. One morning, I stood in front of it and traced the outline of my face in the brushstrokes, feeling the texture beneath my fingers. And I whispered, not to the room, not to anyone in particular, but to myself, "This happened. I let it happen. And I will carry it. Not as a wound. Not as a secret. But as a truth. One of many. Because life, I had come to understand, isn't about holding on to the versions of ourselves that once felt safe. It's about finding the courage to stand beside the ones we became when we stopped pretending. And in that moment, I finally exhaled. Not to let go, but to begin again.